So if you'll hold on, we will be ready to go in just a few minutes. Let me use the chat tool at the bottom. Please ask your questions that way, and at the appropriate time, we'll go through them. So as we know, with the advent of Zoom, we can all be distributed throughout many different places. I'm in Schenectady, New York right now. Laura is probably near her home. I assume that must be up in Hudson Falls area, maybe.
Granville, right on the Vermont border. I'm in Granville, yeah.
Okay, and also joining us is Lauren Anderson, who will be doing some of the technological board work tonight to keep everything running smoothly, and she's in Cobleskill. So our program is pruning, fruiting trees and bushes and brambles. And so with that, let me introduce our guest presenter, Laura McDermott. Laura is an educator with the Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture team. And the Eastern Commercial Horticulture team is a Cornell Cooperative Extension team, of which Schoharie County participates in. And the team serves the commercial interest of vegetables, fruit, both large tree, vine, and ground fruit such as strawberries, both in conventional and organic technologies, and answers many questions with the growers. So with that, Laura, you might want to give a little bit more background about yourself. Please do that if you'd like to. And we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'll turn it over now. If you'd please welcome Laura McDermott. Laura?
Thank you, Don. Thank you very much. And the rest of you folks, I apologize for not having my own picture in the participant panel. It's actually my husband. He had done a presentation for some 4-Hers and about horse care. So that is not me, but here I am. I'm assuming you can see me. For some reason, I'm not seeing myself. Maybe I clicked a thing where I didn't have to look at myself. So can you guys see me?
We can. And also,
okay.
if I might, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but for those who are not have not used Zoom a lot, if you go up, you'll see one of two views. You can see the one view, which is the gallery view, which you can see all the participants. But because we have so many, you may want to click on the speaker view at the top, and that will allow your screen to focus on the presenter tonight. So yes, we can see you very well, Laura.
Okay, great. And you'll probably be able to see where I've spent much of my winter is up in the loft kind of home office, where we've been doing a ton of Zooms for growers, and it's a wonderful tool. I think the pandemic would have been extremely challenging if we weren't able to use this really great tool. So I'm happy to have you guys here. And we're going to get started. I'm going to share my screen, and first we're going to take a look at a few slides. Let me just get this started so we can view it as slideshow. So hopefully everyone can see that. And this is just the beginning. And I want to make sure to thank Middlefield Orchards. They were the ones that hosted us. Some of these pictures are from Middlefield. And they're near Cooperstown, really wonderful, small, local, and very diverse operations. So if you're in the Cooperstown area, don't hesitate to visit them. They've been extremely great cooperators over the year. So in order to get from the left-hand picture to the right-hand picture, we really want to make sure to do proper pruning. And we're not going to talk about pest management. I'll try to answer if you have specific questions about that. We have time, we might be able to deal with that. But really, I'm going to be talking primarily about pruning. And pruning is really, really important for good management of fruiting plants. So one of the things, and many of you are probably already aware that You always need to have good tools. It's very important to use what I call bypass pruners, whether they're loppers or shears. These kinds of pruners have a scissors action so that they're not having a cutting edge that comes up to one blunt edge. They have two sharp edges and they should be sharpened annually. If you do a lot of pruning, you might want to sharpen your pruner several times in a season. It really, really helps. Both your upper body fatigue and the cuts that you make are going to be much better. There's a pull pruner laying in the back. And I'm going to show you a tool that I was lucky enough to purchase for myself last winter and have used it a lot and used it this year. It's a electric backpack pruner, and it makes all the difference. It's extremely expensive for the homeowner, but if you have a couple extra jingle and you don't know what to do with it, it is a wonderful, wonderful thing. But certainly little pruning saws that can fit into tight spaces. And I don't have a photograph here, but another tool that occasionally is really helpful is what we call a pruning wire. And you can find that in forestry magazines, forestry suppliers. So some of the basics that we just want to make sure we get out of the way so we know everybody's on the same footing. These plants that we're going to be talking about are temperate plants, meaning they have to go into dormancy, almost all of them. There's a couple of exceptions, or at least one exception, but they have to go through dormancy. That's the winter period. And so that they can actually, their fruiting buds will actually come burst, flower, and you can have fruit. This is important to the whole cycle of the plant. And pruning that plant is usually done in the period February to April, before the plants come out of dormancy fully, before the buds break. That will make the plant will understand that it's been pruned, but it will not react in a really kind of aggressive way and put out more than you need as far as shoots. So pruning, dormant pruning is done in February to April. That's the bulk of the pruning that we do on woody plants. And then you do some training in spring and summer. The training is to encourage productive fruiting wood, which is usually horizontal branches. Branches that are horizontal tend to be less vegetatively vigorous and more fruitful. So that's really important. And the other thing you're doing is making sure to open up the canopy of the trees so that there's enough sun. And I use this little schematic, which is just kind of a goofy little thing, but I use it in Master Gardener training all the time. And it shows 3 branches that have apples on them. And there's one branch that it's a broken branch or a kind of a dead end branch, and that needs to be pruned back here. And then there's a branch that is going straight up. And oftentimes, if you think of suckers and other kinds of root suckers and suckers that come off of the side of the branch, they're often very vegetative. You don't see the small spur growth that we like to see, that we'll see some pictures that Lauren has taken in the video. So you don't see that, and that's what's going to be fruitful. So taking that vegetative branch that's going to have a lot of leaves on it and shade this fruit is also important. And then maybe even this branch, because it's going underneath and going down, so you're not going to get good sunlight. And sunlight is really important for fruit quality, which is why we do a lot of the pruning in the summer as well. Oops, sorry, trying to barely see those little arrows at the bottom. There we go. So and we're going to talk about things kind of in this logical order, where we'll start with tree fruit, then we'll go to grapes, and then we'll go into some of the berries. Pruning and training starts really early in the plant's life. So when you put that plant in, and we call these single stems whips. This is usually an apple. Often you'll get a cherry, or most any of the fruiting trees will come as whips. Maybe some of them will have a little bit of branching, but you want to head that back a little bit. And the reason for that is that you're removing that tip, that very apical bud. The apical bud itself suppresses lateral branching. It is an auxin producer, and auxin suppresses lateral branching. So when you remove that, when you head it back, it causes these lateral branches, these side shoots to jump out. And that's a really important physiological point to understand when you're using. The biggest thing I want to get through to folks in home garden pruning is that pruning is rejuvenative. When you prune, you get more growth. So here we go. We made one cut. We get lots of side shoots. And in the fall, that'll fall off. That first year of growth, you might want to do something like this. Even then, you could take something like a clothespin and just make those shoots kind of go out at a more of a 90-degree angle. A 90-degree angle is a strong branching angle. It'll hold the fruit better when it gets to that age. And it also is a slower growing branch that is more fruitful. When you see straight up suckers, that's when they're more vegetative and less fruitful.
Yeah.
Excuse me,
I
Laura.
got you.
There's a question in the chat box asking if this is right after you plant.
Yes, this is right after you plant when you head them back. That's exactly right. They should be headed back. Just really, you don't want to take half the tree off, just 6 or so inches, just to get to another bud and try to spur that lateral branching. All right, and then just another little note about size of trees. This is a very common, it's a common question for master gardeners, for me. But when we are growing fruit trees, most all of them in the trade are, they're grafted plants. And so they're grafted onto a rootstock. The scion is the cultivar like Empire or Macintosh. And then the rootstock has completely different genetics, but that is, so it's physically like grafted. They put a little tape around it and it just sits there and grows together. The tissue grows together. This is not, I want to make sure everybody understands, this is not genetic modification. This is grafting, which has been around for centuries and centuries. And what happens is the rootstock imparts some characteristics to this scion, and one of that is dwarfing, some of that is vigor. Precocious bearing is another thing. So the smaller the tree is, because it's on one of these, like what we call M9 or Bud 9, they're both very small trees that usually are 8 to 10 feet in height, except when you have some very rich soil like Middlefield Orchard does, they're considerably taller, but most of the time they're quite small, which is great for a homeowner, so you don't have to use ladders. When you see in a catalog where they say M26, M7, M106, or maybe they don't even say that, they'll lump them all together in a category called semi-dwarf. And semi-dwarf could mean anything from 10 feet to 20 feet. Big difference, right, for a homeowner? And then when you get into the 111s and other things, those are just larger trees that are not used a whole heck of a lot anymore, because they're so vigorous. So what they will do sometimes is put a piece of M9 in with a 111. There'll be 3 different genetics in that tree, and then they'll kind of use it that way. But that's just probably maybe more than you really needed to know, but I wanted to make sure you understood. So the M9, the rootstock, not only controls size, it also controls hardiness of the plant going through the winter. It controls precocious bearing. So the smaller the tree, the faster it goes through its juvenile period. And so that's another great thing for home gardeners. We want to have it start being able to be mature and producing fruit and flowers as soon as possible. All right, so we'll talk about a couple of different types of cuts. Heading back is what we talked about initially. You just take the shoot right off, and that creates a lot of growth from these side buds that you might not even see, but they're there. Pinching is really, it's just removing very new tissue, some green tissue. And thinning is where you bring that entire branch back to its point of attachment. So this is a thinning cut, much less, oddly enough, much less invigorating to the plant. So the more thinning cuts you can do, the less growth you'll have come from that cutting. A heading off cut is invigorating. A thinning cut is not nearly as invigorating. Another thing to just keep in mind, and I won't spend too much more time, we'll get to the meat of this lecture, but I want to make sure people understand the reason for shrinking some of the sizes of these trees is not only a safety thing for workers, it not only makes it easier to move new varieties into production because it's a shorter juvenile period because they're precocious, but also these large seedling trees that we used to love and I still absolutely love in a landscape. They're phenomenally gorgeous when they're blooming, but they are filled with shade inside the canopy. You can get almost 2/3 of the plant, or the plant is not producing fruit that has good sunlight. So the top third has great full sunlight. So that fruit is going to be high quality. But then as you go further into this tree, it becomes less and less productive, and the fruit that is there is not of high quality. So that's another reason that the entire tree fruit industry has gone to these smaller trees. So another way that we can do that from a home perspective is the way that canopy looks like to maximize that light interception. And these Christmas tree or pyramidal kind of shapes actually help us do that, because you have the exterior, which has all 100% light, and then the interior is smaller and smaller, and the smaller the tree gets, the smaller that area of shade relative to the rest of the fruit canopy is. So that's why another reason, another diagram to show why these trees have shrunk in size. And we do this not by, I mean, here's some other shapes on the bottom diagram. Some of these kind of things that can go onto a trellis. Some of these are espaliers, you know, these kinds of horizontal fruiting things that can be trained to a wall or a fence. That's all great. But a lot of times we create these pyramid shapes through training to what we call a tall spindle or a central leader. Both of those, this is a central leader. This is the most common single central trunk with evenly spaced branches. The main branches are pushed out with spreaders, either using little things like clothespins or larger things like commercial spreaders, which are basically just pieces of wood that kind of push down the branches. And in some orchards that you might visit in upstate New York, you might see things like water jugs hanging from branches, or even cement blocks or bricks. I've seen those things hanging, and all that is just to provide weight and to try to train those branches down so that they are more horizontal, slower growing, and more fruitful. A year after the planting, we're going to try to remove things that are branches that are either too low, that might be stacked on top of one another. This is a kind of over the board picture of spreading out those branches, but you get the gist, I think. Second year after the planting, we're pushing the remaining branches out to create a really good scaffold. We're keeping that nice central leader, that primary upright branch. And I'm going to stop sharing for a minute so that Lauren can now turn on the video, and the video does not have any audio, so I can kind of talk you through it a little bit as she plays it. Is it going? I seem slightly frozen. Oh, there we go. Those were still pictures. Okay, so these are all M9, and you can see that they're definitely not 8 feet tall. They have very, very rich soil. This picture is a picture of the spur growth that I was talking about. See how the internodes are very, very tight together? This is fruiting buds. All of these are fruiting buds, and that's what we want to save. Some of these I'm just trying to this is an attempt, folks, at trying to make sure that you can understand what we're doing, and I hope it doesn't confuse the issue. But right now I'm taking out see all these very vertical shoots? almost all of them have to be removed. The shoots, the root suckers at the bottom have to be taken out. The ones that are coming right up from a tree branch, a main scaffold branch. And if you look closely, you can see that there's the central leader, that trunk that's going straight up. And here are the scaffold branches that have been trained to be quite horizontal. And those are the things I'm going to prune back to, but still leave maybe a little bit of new wood coming out. This is another good point. See how there's a little tiny bit of a lip or a end of that twig. You don't want to cut down into what we call that branch collar. You want to see there's another picture of a branch collar. You don't want to cut into that because then your cut won't heal very well. So it's okay to leave a little bit of a nub. This is a little bit longer than I would have liked, and this is not a very aggressive one, but just make sure not to cut into that branch collar. Really important. So this tree that I'm working on did not get pruned last year. And that's why it's just really, these apples truly need to be pruned every single year in order to keep them where they need to be. If you can look in the background, here's one that has been pretty well pruned, and mostly it's smaller branches with the exception of one branch that, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that one branch that's going up. We don't want another lateral branch to compete with the central leader. So trying to do that is helpful. I'm actually using Willie's pruner. This is the backpack pruner I was talking about. It's got a battery in the back, and all I have to do with my one little finger, my index finger, is just click that little thing, and it click, 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 just cuts off things. It is fabulous. Willie is talking about just trying to make sure that these branches are pushed out, and that's important, making sure that they're going to be trained horizontally. It's interesting. I feel like I'm just going so slowly here. I didn't feel like that actually when I was doing it. But what I'm also trying to do here is making sure that people know the angle of your cut is not as important as pruning back to a bud that's pointing in the right direction. So I'm actually trying to do that so that the bud doesn't go down, but the bud is going out, and maybe it's not right on the top of the branch, so it's not going up, but that is important, trying to just keep those branches, again, as horizontal as possible, and just trying to remove things that are pointing straight up. We took literally hours of pruning video, and we got this, and I think it's a really good. So here's a pole pruner. So we're going to take out, if you can see, we're going to take out some of these bigger upright branches. In Middlefield Orchard, they like to leave a little bit of a, here's one that was pruned, a little bit of a leader, but they prune out everything else. So there's really only one leader, and then it's trimmed back. So they kind of control the overall growth that way. You could really prune out all of this, but you do get a ton of growth. So here's another picture of a tree that still needs some work up in the back. But you can see here, that's the one we were working on, how empty a lot of that, all that lateral stuff has been taken away.
So Laura,
yes.
we have a question, if I
Sure.
could.
Yes.
The question is how long do you leave branch spreaders in? And is it okay to use branch spreaders as you're pruning in dormant rather than waiting until spring?
Yes, you can put branch spreaders on almost any time. The thing that I would caution, if it's a young tree, I would use the spreader and not the weight. I have seen the weight break limbs because they're just, the limbs are too small to handle the weight. The weight is really used on very large lateral limbs. And so using the spreaders is a great idea. You can leave them in. Usually they're taken out after 2 seasons because they start to grow, the whole plant starts to grow so rapidly. You don't want them to become embedded into the tree tissue. So you just have to kind of keep an eye on that. But yeah, it is a art. This is why pruning is called an art. A lot of this is an art, and we try to teach the kind of scientific reasoning behind it, but getting out there and doing it, it takes patience and it takes effort to get it to where you want it to be.
And another question, should the cuts be horizontal or should they be at an angle to allow water to run off? And then secondly, do you prune, seal these cuts or allow to air dry?
Totally air dry, that's an easy one. Even large cuts, it is not recommended in the horticulture trade to seal them any longer. Air drying. Now, and pruning so that it is as clean a cut as possible. The angle or the horizontalness often do not matter. If it is a very upward facing or for some reason you are worried about water pooling on top of, say, a large trunk, I would try to get it so that it drained off. But in fact, most trees, if they're pruned at the right time of year, and this is why you don't wait until they're already budding, because then they're going to be pushing out sap, and that can create a problem as well. So pruning now before the buds break is really the best timing.
And then lastly, Laura, the other comment I would add is to remind folks that this is not the way you prune an ornamental flowering plant. That is for aesthetics, and this is purely based on productivity. And I noticed, Laura, that on a lot of the tops of the trees where you had knots and dense branching patterns, how much of that do you leave in on the long run, or does some of that have to be removed over time?
A lot of it has to be removed. We don't like to have that clustered growth of branches. We really try to remove that as much as possible. You know, the problem for orchardists, and especially for smaller ones like Middlefield that don't have the labor pool, it is really hard to get this pruning done every single year. It's a lot of pruning. So I think it's that kind of situation that you sometimes see things that are not aggressively pruned. But I can say that unless you top things, unless you really just hit it way too hard, most of the 95% of the pruning problems are from under pruning. Under pruning is the biggest challenge for home gardeners, and trying to really prune off tissue is okay.
Do you have a rule of thumb on what the interval of growth you should go between having lateral or horizontal branches or side branches?
It really kind of depends on usually I would say we don't like them to be closer than a foot, you know, for lateral branches, especially if they're on the same like trajectory, if they're stacked on each other. If they're slightly rotated, that's okay, so that they can get all the sun. But that's probably a good 12 inches is probably a good rule of thumb.
Laura, we have a couple other questions. What is the best way to control or rid the tree of those bottom suckers? And I know this is a big problem with ornamentals as well, so I'll let you address that one.
Well, honestly, I don't think many of the orchards, the commercial orchards, are not using that many sucker prevention tools. They just mostly are pruning. And interestingly enough, so here's something else that happens. If you keep at this, the tree settles down, and after a while, you do not get as many. You still get some, but you don't get the proliferation you will if you just do it every 2 or 3 years. You know, if you're doing it annually and you keep doing it for 3 to 4 years, the tree starts to settle down and goes into more productive, just this kind of productive space, fruiting space, rather than vegetative.
And can you use ropes and stakes to train branches down instead of weights? I think you've answered that, but if you would just address that quickly again.
Yes, you can use that. There are staples that you can use to kind of staple into the ground, strings or ropes or something to kind of pull that down. But it is really important to do that, especially in the first 2 to 4 years of training that tree. It's very important to get that done.
I've learned the hard way that making too many cuts can encourage a lot of vegetative vertical growth.
Yes.
Let's see. Once this happens, I have to make even more cuts every year to trim off all the new growth. How can I break this vicious cycle?
It is really hard, but the key to it is not to ignore it for a year. A lot of people will think, oh, if pruning invigorates it, well, I'll just let it go. I'll start to do biannual pruning. That does not work. That ends up so you get this just giant flush of growth every other year. You might stop pruning even for a few years. You have to just keep at it. And some cultivars are much worse at putting out vertical growth than others. The vigor is one thing you might want to ask yourself. If you're over fertilizing, that might have something to do with it, making sure that you're pruning at the right time. You can take growth off, summer prune. You can take some growth off in the summer. After fruit set has happened, there's about a 6-week window where you can actually go in and remove some things. And that also is a good time to kind of let air movement and more sun into the canopy. And often, especially if you're able to do it a little bit closer to August, it doesn't create quite as much regrowth from those cuts. So that might be another tip, is to do your summer pruning. You still want to do your winter dormant pruning, but then come again in the summer and try to clean up some of that stuff that's sprouted. How's that?
Back to you, Laura.
Okay. Actually, I'm going to go, I think I can share my screen real quick. I hope this is working. We're going to go to pruning peaches, and then we'll see a video, but I just wanted to show a couple of slides. Here is the peaches. There are some rootstocks for peaches, but there's not nearly the choices. The big thing about this is you have to prune later in the year, usually when they're flowering, because oftentimes, especially in upstate New York, we don't get reliable fruiting. And so you want to make sure you're pruning good viable wood and not just all, you're taking the good viable wood out and leaving the dead stuff. You want to make sure you're getting rid of what you need to get rid of. Prune them hard every year and prune them to this bowl shape. There's no real central leader, and the video will actually show this pretty well when we go to that. And so can we go to that now, Lauren? I'm going to stop sharing. I'll go to the video. So this is a peach tree. You can see here how there's this open, most of the lateral branches are kind of bowed out, and they are kind of like leaders, but they're off to the side. And what you need to do is take off these center ones that are going right up, some of these root suckers. You might take off some of this stuff. And again, I'm doing it at the wrong time of year. I would wait probably 3 to 4 weeks. So that we can make sure that these things are actually, they're going to actually bloom. But pruning hard is really, really important because they overset, and this wood is relatively weak. And if you get them oversetting, that can be a real problem. So honestly, it's so funny here. Here I have a helper with some maybe sharper pruners. He's coming in to prune and just moving out that stuff. I think I'm going to move this one out as well because it's a little low. This is just too upright, and this one is also too upright. So those will definitely go. But that's kind of what you're looking for, is this this larger picture. And here's a good example of why a pruning wire might be really helpful, because you could slide that into that tough cut instead of me doing what I'm doing and yanking it around and making a poor cut. You could take that wire in, and just with a couple zip, 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 you could actually take it out of there and make a much easier and better cut. All right, I think we can move on, Lauren.
Well, while we're doing that, a couple more questions.
Okay, great.
Let's
we can
see
keep
if
watching
I can
it. We can keep
get
watching it
this
while
here. How much can a mature tree be cut back since it hadn't been trimmed in years?
So that's a great question, and one that we get a ton. What we use is kind of this, after you've removed all of the dead tissue, then take a look at it, and you can take 1/3 of the remaining living tissue out of the canopy of the tree without any problem whatsoever. In apples, in truth, you could probably remove much more, but you're going to end up with that same problem that one attendee said, that if you take a ton of cuts in one year, you're going to have so much pruning to do the following year that you'll be depressed. So a third is a really good starting point. Then you go in, clean it up the following year with some of the younger stuff that you don't want, where it's in there, and then you remove another probably third of older tissue. And then that third year you come in and take out the other remaining tissue that is older and just not very productive. And so hopefully over a 3 to 4 year period, you can really bring this thing back into shape.
And I noticed, Laura, this is a peach, I believe, right?
Yes.
I noticed this is not like the apple where you maintain the central leader. This is more of an open scaffold,
Yes.
kind of an older pruning style, isn't it?
Yes, this is what we call an open vase, and they use this for a lot of stone fruit. It's used for plums. It's used for peaches and nectarines and apricots, and it is just allows some more growth in there, and it's a little bit stronger way to fruit and get stuff in there. And we can stop for a second, and then we'll go to grapes. And I think I heard somebody had a question. I saw it briefly flash over my chat about
this. Maybe this is it. Is pear pruning similar to apple pruning?
Yeah,
My pear trees seem to have all branches curving upward.
Yes, pear pruning is more similar to apples, and we didn't have any pears. I'm sorry. Pears are very, very upright. And the other thing about pear pruning is that we try not to prune them too much because they are extremely sensitive and vulnerable to, oh my gosh, it just went right out of my head. Fire blight, excuse me, fire blight. Fire blight is a bacterial disease that is very hard to control, and its pears just succumb terribly to it. So pruning invites fire blight because it leaves a avenue of entry for the inoculum. So it's really important to not prune, just prune very judiciously. And it's okay to try to get the branches, the lateral branches, to kind of spread out a little bit using some of those spreaders, but try not to overly prune in order to get that to work. Remove some of the vigorous, like the root suckers and stuff like that. But other than
let me ask you at this point, what home sanitation for home gardeners, what sanitation procedures do you recommend for pruning equipment and its frequency? Any at all?
Well, we do, especially if you think there's any kind of fire blight, and I dare say that we have fire blight almost everywhere in New York State now. 30 years ago, I thought we had almost eradicated it. It seemed like we didn't see much, but now we definitely see a lot of it. And you should be cleaning your pruners in between cuts. Especially if you're going from diseased tissue into healthy tissue. So those things are just a dip in an alcohol or like a rubbing alcohol or a Clorox or a bleach-based solution, a 10% bleach solution, that will be enough. And you have to do that in between each cut in order to try not to spread that. That's about the only disease that I'm really that concerned about spreading through pruning cuts. Apple scab, a lot of the other fungal disease, the fruit rot diseases, all of those things are spread from leaving a lot of debris in the orchard, on the orchard floor. So raking up old leaves, getting the branches that you cut out of the orchard. And if you think you've got a lot of disease problems, burning them, burying them, getting them off the property is much better than composting them. So, being aware of that kind of sanitation recommendation.
On fire blight, the question from Paul is, would coating the cut ends not help prevent fire blight?
Not really, because they've done a lot of research on this, and it is, the coating has to happen so quickly after the cut that it's almost ridiculous. They can get infected right away. So, and then it traps it in there. So when you leave the cut open to the air, the spores or even bacteria might fall onto the, it might get onto the cut end, but that tissue is rapidly walling itself off. When you seal them in, when you seal those pathogens in with a sealant, then you've got this kind of moist situation. The cells of the plant are not able to kind of fully close it off and form a callus. And so then you just have more problems. And this has really been, in the last, I would say 40 years, transformational to plant health, not using those kinds of pruning sealants.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to jump into grapes now. Again, this is a dormant season pruning. Pruning right now is a great time to do that, and also training. And grapes are another one of these plants that you have to prune them very, very hard every year in order to get them to fruit and have good quality fruit. Oops, sorry, I went too far. So basically we start with the plant on the left, or much more aggressive, who knows, and you're going to remove about 90% of the new growth. You want to make sure that you have a lot of wood that is just from last year. That 1-year-old wood is what's going to bear the most fruit. It's the most productive. And so all the older stuff you're going to try to get rid of. This is really hard for people that haven't done it before, because it is so, it's just quite shocking. But if you're looking at following what we call the 4-arm Niffin system, this is kind of an older commercial system. It's been replaced a little bit by a few other systems that people are trying. But basically, you're using a 2-wire trellis. The first wire is about 2 feet off the ground, maybe 2.5, depending upon your own situation. And then you let it grow up to the second year, the year after planting. And this main cane is what stays forever, can stay like for decades, really, as long as it doesn't get killed by cold weather. So if you have a hardy plant, and this is what gets really big and gnarly, and that's what you see in really like California and Italy, where you've got some of the older vines that are really big. This is what it starts out looking like. So then after that spring, as these lateral buds break, you're going to kind of train them out to the different wires. And then by the later in the season, you're actually going to have about 10 or so buds on every single one of these laterals. And that's it. That's all you need to have. Then it's removing all of that green growth throughout the season. So if you've ever been in a grape producing area, you'll notice that they go through several times a year just removing leaves and trying to keep some of the shoot growth down a little bit. But so that is what we want to see. Most of the fruit is going to be born in that area right closer to the cane, because that's where your fruit bud development is going to be earliest, and that's where you're going to have the best quality fruit. It's just another picture. About 10 buds along here. You're going to tie it with some twine or with a max tapener or something. A lot of times if you're growing a plant that is a little bit less hardy, you might want to leave some of these renewal spurs, which are just something, so say this gets frozen or this gets caught or something, you've got something that can come out here and take its place. And oftentimes even people will leave a second trunk kind of growing in order to protect them during the winter. And that will maybe develop later in the season, and it'll just come up and you'll kind of winter the whole thing, and then hopefully that your main trunk will be fine, but you've got that extra one just in case. All right, let's see those videos. Lauren, if you don't mind.
Real quick, there's another question about peaches.
Okay.
Would you leave the small branches that are left in the example picture?
You know, in peaches, you do want to not, and this goes for apples too. A lot of people get overly zealous about cleaning up all the little tiny twigs, just every single thing. You don't have to be that, you know, sometimes it can actually work against you because you've removed some of the little bit of shading that they get on those larger branches, and you can have some sun scald problems. So you want to remove stuff that is too upright. And again, remember, you're removing a lot of plant twigs. So you're going to have to remove a lot of that old stuff too. So yes and no. How's that? You don't want to go crazy and like trim every single thing off, because the peaches are born on 1-year-old wood mostly. So you want to leave some of that, but you also want to be able to renew and not have so much weight. And if you get so many fruit that do set, they're very small. They're never extremely good quality. So again, pruning is your friend.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right, so here we go. We've got this grapevine. I'm mostly just trying to prune off a lot of the side shoots. I feel like I should have put this on a little bit faster speed so you could have thought I was really, really, really fast, but I feel like I'm so slow doing this. It seemed like I was working right along. But all those bottom branches, they're the old canes. We're gonna, I think we keep just cutting them out if they're competing. You want to have something. This trellis too was a little bit, you have to be really, you really have to set a grape trellis up that has extremely taut wires so that you can train it to them. And this is a problem. It's very hard to do that and keep it that way. So a lot of times the wires get loose, they get stretched out, and then you don't have anything to train them to, and the plant suffers from that. I mean, it's just a more challenging thing for people to pick in. So again, just kind of clearing stuff out. And we do get to a point here that you can see. I'm going to take off some more small things.
Or is that 1 year's growth?
Yes, yes. Willie said he did these last year. It's crazy, right?
Well, you're right about one thing. I think for the average home gardener, it's painful to think you're doing the right thing by being super aggressive with grapes.
Yeah, it is. And the other thing about grapes is because they are so, many varieties are not winter hardy. So we lose them. And this is the same with peaches. And the thought of pruning them out voluntarily is just terrible because the winter often does it for us. So this is what we're ending up with. You want to have that tied up a little bit, and there is a stake there that you can tie it to. That's another thing. Can we pause that, Lauren? I just want to show them something. I didn't point this out. So this is another really important thing. In the background, see those stakes? Those stakes used to be straight up. There was a windstorm that came through and a Hurricane Irene actually, that blew all of these over. But ideally, these stakes would be still there. And when they're young, when the plants are young, these are incredibly important to give you a structure to train against. So using this metal conduit is a very popular one to train the plant to. And then you can kind of, it just gives you that vertical leader to go with. And the same goes here. This conduit gives you some kind of frame, and then the wire would be there so that you can put the laterals on it. Okay, sorry. I could probably play it actually. I think I can do that, I don't know. But then trying to figure out which one goes where, making sure that that lower wire, you do not want it to, okay, so then we're gonna go to blackberries. Let me stop.
Excuse me, Laura, what is the best time to prune the grapes? Right now, dormant, right now in March?
Yes, yep.
Thank you.
Before the bud breaks. Yep.
Thank you.
All right, so let me share again. We're gonna go back to the PowerPoint and we're gonna talk about raspberries. And I don't have any good blackberries, but basically for raspberries and blackberries, you have two different types of fruit. You have summer fruiting, or what we call floricane plants, or you have fall fruiting, often also called everbearing, but these are primocane plants. And all that means is that on these varieties, they have to go through a chilling period. They have to experience that chilling in order to have fruit. Now, chilling is a weird thing because chilling does not mean freezing. Chilling is usually, you get chilling hours between like 45 and 55 in general, very slightly for plant, but in general, that's when you gain. And so every hour of time that you have between 45 and 55 degrees, it's called one chilling hour. Most of our temperate plants are somewhere between 800 and 1,000, basically, chilling hours that they require in order to break dormancy and start to grow again in the spring. We do not have, we do not really have any problems with that. The only time we might occasionally have problems with that is if we break dormancy really early and things are kind of kooky, or if we have a very long, cool fall into December where we're getting, just the right temperatures, hasn't gone cold enough yet because once it's cold, it doesn't get the chilling. And if it stays in that kind of moderate temperature, then they start to break dormancy in December. And you've seen this with like flowering plants. I'm sure forsythia is very common for this to happen, that it gets enough chilling and it breaks dormancy, and you've got flowering in January when you've got some very cold temperatures. And of course, that really vulnerable tissue it's hurt, it's burned badly and killed. So we want to have plants that have an adequate amount of chilling so that they don't do that. So getting cultivars that are recommended for the mid-Atlantic, the Carolinas, very dangerous, because you can fall into this kind of cycle where they're always popping out of dormancy too early and you can't get them through the bulk of the cold winter. So anyway, with the primocanes, and the reason that works really well with tree fruit, and it works fairly well with grapes, and it works great with blueberries, but raspberries and blackberries are something different. They don't need as much chilling, so that they were often popping out too early. And that's one of the reasons they get a fair amount of winter injury. So we just, do the best we can. So let's talk about summer fruiting, a floricane plant. The primocane comes up. That's what we call the first year plant. Just grows that first year. Then it changes. We call it a floricane after it goes through the winter, and that's when it bears the fruit. And during that same time, the new primocanes come up. You remove the old cane that's already fruited and let these new canes proliferate and bear the fruit. And there's a lot of different types of raspberry that are summer fruiting. There's yellows and purples and blacks and reds. And then fall fruiting, we mostly just have red and yellows. They don't need chilling, so you can plant them in the spring. In the fall, the primocanes start growing right away, but it takes them a while to actually set fruit. So it's usually in late August and early September. And that is your first crop. Doesn't need chilling. The next year, new crop comes up, new primocanes come up. If you leave this cane, the laterals will actually have more fruit on it. So you could have fruit in July, and then the primocanes will have fruit in the fall. And that's where it gets its everbearing name. It's not really everbearing, and this summer crop is always smaller, but that's basically what it's called. And I'm sure there are some questions, but I'll get to them in just a second. So here's a basic trellis. It's just a V trellis, making sure that you get the right dimensions here. It's about 1.5 feet wide at the bottom and 3.5 feet wide at the top. These are just snow stakes, nothing fancy. You can use wooden stakes as well. You could use a T stake instead of having an anchor stake like this. But you're allowing the fruit to grow up in the middle. You pull the floricane, the fruiting canes out to the side, the primocanes to grow up in the middle, and then you're able to pick off of these fruit that's being tied to those the wires that are spread out. Makes harvesting a lot easier, reduces interference, and it keeps the berries off the ground. All of that very, very important. And so here's just a couple more schematics. So this is in the winter at this time of year when you're looking at your summer fruiting. You've probably got some old canes that you didn't get out of there in time. You've got a lot more canes than you really need. So you want to make sure to thin them out. We usually say about 4 canes per square foot. And I like to have a narrow row. I try to get growers to keep that row nice and narrow. 12 inches is preferable, no more than 18 inches wide, because you end up getting a hedge and it's impossible to pick in there. It creates a very humid environment, really great for some pest problems. The picture on the bottom is a picture of black raspberries and purple raspberries, and they are grown, they don't grow along in a row with suckers coming up. They grow kind of in a hill. And so when you get them at this time of year, you want to thin them out to 3 or 4 canes per hill. And then you want to cut off all of these lateral branches to about, maybe somewhere between 3 and 6 inches. And that kind of tries to help them, keep them a little bit in control. So this is, again, 3 to 4 canes per linear foot of row. And summer bearing, you're going to tip. Oh, this is in the very spring when they start growing, when you plant them. You want to tip them a couple inches. When they get to be about 2 feet tall, you tip them so that they can have more lateral buds. You don't need to do that as much after they get established, because they tend to have a lot of lateral buds and they're already breaking. But if you do think that for some reason there's just not as many fruiting canes as you'd like, you can come in and tip them, and that will create more lateral branching and more fruiting area. And then you try to train these along a trellis, a 2-wire trellis, to keep them up off the ground. Okay, let's see that video. And we've got some pictures of blackberry, and I think it's important for people to see the blackberry canes if you've never grown blackberries. So here we are in blackberries first. Blackberries can be, most of the blackberries we grow in our region are floricane blackberries, because the primocane blackberries require too long a season, and their fruit does not get, they don't have a very good quality fruit. Our blackberries down south, the blackberries are ripening probably in early July. Down up here, they don't really get to ripen until about maybe mid-August if you're super lucky, but mostly in September. And this is a good lesson for pruning apparel. Do not wear a hat with that big pom-pom on it, because you're going to notice that it constantly gets caught on these canes. It's just a terrible pain. But it was so cold I couldn't take it off. Plus it was protecting my head, because if you saw these canes, they're very dangerous thorns on them. And so basically I'm just trying to go as low as possible, right into the ground almost, which is terrible on your shears. You really have to keep pruning them, but that's a prostate cane that had to get out. You want to try to get any woody vine weeds, like there was a fair amount of bittersweet in this planting that had to be removed. All the old fruiting canes have to be taken out because they will not add anything. They're pretty much dead. And this gives you a little bit, after I'm pruning there for a while, we have a slightly better, but see how wide that row is? I'd like to see that row smaller. These plants are very erect, and they don't get fruit every single year because they do get frozen out. There is a trellis called a rotating cross arm trellis, or a swing trellis, which allows you to lay these fruiting canes down in the winter and cover them with remay or even just organic mulch to keep them from getting winter injured. And there are several videos if you go into the videos, and here I am doing a little tipping on some lateral branches that I'm going to keep, just trying to control the overall length and size of these. Many growers would say prune that down a little bit more. I always am a little nervous when I'm pruning. Oh, and I wanted to just show, be really careful when you're pruning ground things like caneberries. If it has a trickle hose, Many people have cut those hoses, so just be careful of that. But it's hard to prune. So here's another picture of some of those buds that are coming out. Look at those thorns. That's what I'm also showing. So that's why you want to wear really good gloves, leather gloves to protect your hands, a jacket that's going to shed and not catch all the time. All of that is very important, but just kind of getting an idea. So on the left is the finished and on the right is what it would look like beforehand, and just constantly pruning. So now we're in red raspberries, and these are the summer raspberries. And these are, again, the row is a little bit wider than I would like. I'd like to, have that be a little bit smaller. I'd also like to see the canes be a little bit more vigorous. The width of a really good fat Sharpie would be great. I'm trying to remove all of the old canes out of there. And if I were doing this and not talking, I was talking the entire time I was doing this. If you were doing this and not talking, you just start pruning. Everything at the edge had to go. Anything that's in the middle can stay, but basically just get rid of it and then get it out of the area, because there are so many cane diseases of raspberries that's another real problem. That's some of the bittersweet that I'm pulling on right there. I don't know if we can answer any questions about.
Yeah, I've got some questions and a comment. So having grown some brambles myself, I've decided the easiest way to pick raspberries is at Price Chopper. And it's a rough life. One last question before I want to go back to grapes, and I missed this earlier. I think this is a cultural issue. It says, my grapes mature and get shriveled. What am I doing wrong? And I assume that must be a disease problem that's creeping into the pruning.
And Lauren, could you stop this for a sec? Because I want to talk about this as a different type of pruning. So if they get shriveled and they turn kind of black or a dark color, that is probably black rot. It's extremely common fungal disease of grapes. And the time to spray all fruit rots is right around flowering. That's when the infection actually occurs, either right before flowering or right after flowering. So there are a wide variety of fungicides you can use. If you're organic, you could try some of the things that are more sanitizers like oxidate. They're actually labeled for use in with some of these fungal diseases. But and if it's not that, I cannot think right off the top of my head what it would be, but it most likely is cultural, and it's not a, it could be a pest problem. Maybe it's a vigor problem, but probably not. It's probably a pest problem, I think.
Next question, and I don't know, the individual who asked this may have to clarify this. It says, how do you tell the difference between the two kinds if you've lost labels? I think that must be on brambles, I would think. That's probably an impossible question to answer, isn't it?
It's really hard, but one way that you can figure it out is to treat them like a primocane, it's a great segue into this part of the video. So what Willie is doing here is using a hedge trimmer, and a lot of people will actually just drive over these with a, with some kind of flail chopper or something, and chop them down as close as possible to the ground. The challenge with the height that they're at now, and this is a little bit better because they're only a couple of inches tall, but in that initially, and we can switch back here, Lauren, initially that picture showed them where they were about maybe even as much as 10 inches tall. And all of that cane will actually push out flower buds next year. So you'll have this really low early fruit, which you don't want. You don't want to have that. So you have to remove it as close to the ground as you possibly can. Oops, I got a call here, which I don't want to answer. So I'll just put that aside. So are there any other?
Yeah, do you cut back the old canes after fruiting?
Yes, if
The
you
forward
can.
canes.
Yes, if you can remove them, it's the very best practices to remove them as soon as they're done fruiting, because you don't want them to keep taking energy from the crown of the plant, which should go into the primocanes. You don't want them to do that. But it is usually in mid-August that you have to do that. And many people don't like to prune raspberries in mid-August. I can't say as I blame them. So you can do it whenever afterwards. I mean, a lot of times it doesn't get done until the dormant season, and it is what it is, right?
Another question, I think it's cultural in nature. It says we have raspberries and blackberries that haven't grown in 2 years. What would be the reason for that?
You mean they're just dead?
Well, this is a question that's come in. I assume they just aren't putting on much growth, that they're kind of stagnant, and the person who asked that would be Jennifer's iPhone, I think, if that if that's the person. Can you clarify your question a little bit?
So
right.
if she can't, so here's the thing. If you have left, and this happens all the time, and it's just, it's not a bad thing. It's just life, right? When you're growing, you get this patch of raspberries that has been there for sometimes decades without any pruning whatsoever. And they've been pretty decent enough for most homeowners, right? And you're enjoying them. And all of a sudden you realize, wow, I'm not getting but a cup of raspberries on that whole patch. What am I doing wrong? Well, the first thing is you have to prune them because that invigorates the plant, and the crown is probably suffering. The other thing to keep in mind is that from a commercial standpoint anyway, raspberries often they're removed, the planting is removed after 12 or 15 years, even when they've been managed really well, because they just tend to they become unfruitful. They get infected with viruses. They have crumbly berries, or these mottled leaves that look terrible. So these plants are not forever type plants. If you've got a 15-year-old planting and you're looking at it thinking, it's just not the way I'd like it to be, personally, I would try to get rid of it. Now, having said that, that's easier said than done to get rid of raspberry planting. But if you keep mowing it off, you can remove it.
You're not muted.
Next question is on trellising. This participant says that they keep hitting bedrock when they're putting the stakes in. Probably not a lot of answer on that, but do you have any suggestion?
Well, if you cannot even put a trellis in there, how do you expect the plants to grow? So really thin, you just don't want to plant these plants on rock outcropping. They will not thrive.
What time of the year is best for tipping raspberries?
Tipping raspberries in the spring, in the dormant season, is the best time to do that.
Okay, so going back to the question, Jennifer's gave me more information. The question was that she said that the blackberries haven't grown in 2 years, and she says they're just no more growth. They're just kind of sitting there idle, I think is the suggestion.
Okay, and I guess if they are, it still doesn't answer whether or not they've been cared for appropriately, whether they've been fertilized, whether they've been pruned, whether they have a terrible weed problem, whether they're over 12 to 15 years old, whether they have a lot of viruses.
Planted.
I'm sorry?
She says they were newly planted.
So when she says newly planted, were they just planted last year, or were they planted 3 years ago?
I'll wait for her to respond in chat.
So I think the thing is that as a gardener, you have to kind of figure out, am I following best management practices?
They were planted 2 years ago.
Okay, 2 years ago. And did they prune them? So if you don't prune them, if you don't remove that floricane, you will not, at least after that second year, you can let it go ahead and go through a full year cycle. And if it still doesn't have any fruit, then you take it out regardless because it's already matured. And so if you're not removing them and kind of doing that pruning that helps invigorate them, and if you don't really know what your soil type is, if you haven't fertilized, those are the reasons that they're not growing. I mean, if you think about a raspberry, a wild raspberry, they will grow anywhere. So it's likely not your soil because unless, you know, I can't even think of why they wouldn't grow, but they grow on roadsides. You know, they're pretty aggressive plants. Maybe they just don't have enough water. That's another thing.
Well, perhaps we ought to just move on, and I would invite the person to send us more information by email, and we'll see if we can answer the question for them.
Right, and we have some great, well-trained master gardeners in Schoharie and Otsego County, so don't hesitate to send pictures and visit your cooperative extension office. And the master gardeners, if they get stumped, occasionally will call me, and I'm happy to help them try to ferret out the answer. And information is really helpful, so just don't hesitate to try to give us as much information as possible, but thanks for those questions. So blueberries, blueberries are a really great crop to grow. They do need the proper pH, and if somebody had just gave me that exact same question that we had for the raspberries and said I have 2-year-old or 3-year-old blueberries that aren't growing, I would say probably the problem is the pH is not correct. The pH needs to be between 4.5 and 5.0, which for most of our good agricultural soils in New York State, we do not have that acidic soil. So you have to acidify before planting in order to get that soil to go down to the proper pH. If it isn't in the proper pH, it doesn't matter how much fertilizer you put on these plants, they will just sit there. So it's very frustrating. But once they get going, and these pictures are probably of maybe 6 or 7-year-old plants, once they get going, then you have to start managing them. If you think about a blueberry plant, a cane that is 8 years old, which might have been this older one, this bigger one in the center, once it gets to that age, it tends to become not very fruitful. This actually, might be this one. It's this lower one that kind of comes out here. It's a little lower, branches a little low, but it just doesn't have as many fruit buds on it. So that is one that needs to come out. And then anything that is bending out into the row, it's too horizontal, that needs to come out. And again, just like on a caneberry, you have to prune as close to the crown as you possibly can. All of the blueberries' latent buds are down in the adventitious or latent buds are down in the crown of the plant. And that's what you want to spur growth from, because those new canes, rather than having a cane come off of a branch like this, see that one that's going straight up, you want to have some more canes that come right out of the ground from the crown of the plant. So here's a great example. This cane, look at that beautiful cane. It's nice and big and fat, and it gets almost like 3 feet high probably, and it has a little bit of branching, and then it keeps going and branches again. That's a perfect example of a healthy blueberry cane. And then all the fruiting is mostly in the top of the bush, because that's where all the sun is. That's where the best quality berries are going to be. And that's where it's going to be easiest for pickers, you or your customers, depending upon what you're doing. That's where it's going to be easiest to pick. So we want to push growth to the exterior of the canopy. We want to have not as much growth down here. We don't want a lot of this stuff down here. And the other thing is, we want to have approximately, now this plant, if it's really 6 or 7 years old, it should have a few more canes, but maybe it's only 4 or 5. You want 2 canes of every year. So you want 2 1-year-old cane, and here's a 1-year-old cane. You want 2 2-year-old canes. I'm not really sure if this thing here is a 2-year-old cane, but maybe it is. You want 2 3-year-old canes, which I think this might be a 3-year-old cane. You want 2 4-year-old canes, 2 5-year-old canes, 2 6, 2 7, 2 8. So if you've got a really vigorous, well pruned blueberry bush, you're going to have 16 canes, 2 of each for 8 different years.
Wow.
Okay, is that relatively clear? Maybe and actually the video that we have, unfortunately, I don't think it really is. It's not as easy to see on these plants. They're quite small. Let me stop sharing before I forget. Many thanks to Middlefield Orchard and for Lauren Anderson. She was invaluable. We couldn't have done this without her. So I'm really happy to have had her help. So if we could go to that blueberry piece, Lauren. Okay, so these plants are about, I think Willie said they might be about 8 years old. And I'm trying to remove some of the older canes way down in the bottom, close to the crown. These plants, depending upon the cultivar, they may not be as tall as I would have described there. Some of these newer cultivars are smaller, and some of the hardy north, the half-high Northland series are quite small, and I think some of these are the Northland series, so they don't get very big. But you just want to really take out a lot of that new stuff. So see, I'm trying to leave some of the newer canes. I'm trying to get as low as I can. I'm trying to get anything that looks like it's coming out into the alleyway, or if it's branching too low, or if it is crossing and being a real just kind of pain. But again, pruning as low as possible is really important, because that's when it's going to push out and encourage those new canes to develop. One of the real bad problems we have is some of those new canes will actually, so that's the final version of that. I'm trying to leave several different ages of canes and lots of room. But one of the real big problems with some of the new canes is that they grow late in the year and then they get tipped by cold weather that comes in. And so we have that low branching, which is not what we want. So yeah, that's one of the examples. Now this could be because of disease, or it actually could be because of winter temperature to cause that dieback. But as far as I'm concerned, when you see that, you just need to take it out. It's going to be branching so low that it's not going to have good quality fruit, and it's always going to be a pain in the neck to have that particular cane there. But see this green fruit or green cane wood in the front? That's really what I'd like to see more of on these plants. There's just not quite enough of that. It's all this older silver wood, and they're just not as fruitful as that younger green, more vigorous wood.
Should blueberries be pruned annually?
Yes, they should be.
Very good.
And so here's just another kind of picture of me with this is where a saw would come in helpfully a lot of times, because it's a hard angle for a pruner, or again, that pruning wire might be really helpful. But taking those old stubs out, it really, really helps keep the plant cleaner, during that whole fruiting life. The blueberries can live for 60 years productively, so they're worth putting the effort in. All right. Are there any questions about blueberries that I can answer now?
We don't have any at this point.
Okay. I'm going to talk quickly about strawberries, not because you have to prune them, because you don't, thankfully, but strawberries come in both the traditional June bearers, and I don't have any slides on this, Lauren, so we can just look at the, oh, this had audio, right? I can't remember now.
No, it doesn't.
Okay, good. We'll just play it while I'm talking. These pictures, this little video portion is of June bearing, a traditional matted row system of June bearing berries. And they are laying there coming out of dormancy. They had some straw on there to help protect the crowns so that they wouldn't heave out. Honestly, we had such a great year this year. We had a very long period of time where we didn't have temperatures above freezing. So nothing heaved. It was a thing of beauty, really a thing of beauty. So we're just looking, you can see how prostrate, they're not totally dormant because there's still some green leaves and they are still photosynthesizing just a little bit. But when we looked around, there were some new growth. I think I'm getting a little feedback from somebody's mic might be on or something. But there's some new growth right there. And at this point, if your plants were completely covered with straw, as soon as you see that new growth, you want to pull the straw off and let them see the air, get some sun, and start kind of working slowly towards growth. I do want to point out there's a little bit of what we call leaf spot disease on here. That's not terrible to see a little bit of that on some of the older leaves. Somebody wonders about putting strawberries in black fabric. I think putting any of these crops pretty much in black fabric could be useful to homeowners because it's very difficult to, and most homeowners don't want to use herbicides, that they're tricky to manage. And a lot of times mulches, organic mulches are very challenging because of voles. Having said that, I've seen some really bad vole problems underneath black weed mat as well. So do be careful of that. I think that's all I really wanted to say about strawberries. And I think that is the end of the program. So if anybody has any questions still, I'd be happy to answer them. This is going to be recorded and this is going to be available, I think on the Schoharie website maybe. I'm not sure where it'll be available, but the recording of this webinar will be there if you wanted to go back to it.
So let me ask Lauren. Lauren, when do you think we can have this mounted up on our website?
I can get it up tomorrow morning.
Okay, great. There are a couple questions here. Let's see if I can go back and get these. I'm having trouble finding one.
Looks like the first one was from TLNIC. I have a question about peaches, if it's not too late. If you want to unmute yourself. Or you can respond in the chat. In the meantime, the next question is, can blueberry plants be transplanted and what time of year?
It can definitely be transplanted. And right now, as soon as you can dig into that soil, this is the time to transplant them. It would be best to transplant any woody plant before bud break. Some people are doing some transplanting in the fall as the plants senesce and go into dormancy. My worry about that is it really does take a little time for those roots to get settled before, and our weather is so unpredictable that I'm still anxious about transplanting in the fall. I do know people have done it and have had good luck, but the preferable time as far as I'm concerned is still the spring.
I have a question from a master gardener, and it's this. I have shoots coming, this is on brambles. I have shoots coming up everywhere. Will I have an eternal raspberry patch?
Yes. Really, you just have to keep cutting it, keep mowing them. Just try to get them mowed as quick as they pop their little heads out, and you will eventually weaken the crown of the plant. But I mean, I even have really, unless you till it and kind of dig up all of those crowns, it's very difficult. And then even doing that and then spraying a non-selective herbicide that occasionally some growers have done to try to get rid of them, even that sometimes doesn't do it. And they're very, very sensitive to things like glyphosate, but they are just, sometimes they just love a site and it's really hard to get rid of them.
Next question on going back to raspberries. I want to put raspberries in where potatoes grew from 1 year. How long do I have to wait before putting plants in? And what do I do for the soil until then?
So This is an excellent question. I feel like this might be a master gardener, a very veteran gardener. So the reason this individual is asking this question is because raspberry plants are in the Rosaceae family and potatoes are in the Solanaceous family. These families are related and share some very bad soil-borne diseases like verticillium, Phytophthora species. And so if you had problems with those potatoes, and you had grown them there for years and years, you probably should stay away from anything else in the Rosaceous or Solanaceous family for 3 to 5 years is the commercial recommendation. If you have not had problems with them and you've been rotating, you know, like one year you'll have cucurbits there, when you'll have corn, and then you put the potatoes in and you just kind of forgot that you wanted to put raspberries in, I think your raspberries are going to be just fine because you haven't had time enough to build up, the pathogen hasn't had time enough to build up in population, even if it was there.
Back to the question about, sorry, go ahead. No, back to the question about peaches. It was what fertilizer is best and when to do so.
So I just focus on inexpensive fertilizer. If you are non-organic, you can just use something like 10-10-10 and put a little fertilizer in the spring of the year. Probably anytime now is fine. Blueberries like it to be a little bit warmer because blueberries don't have very many root hairs. And if you put the fertilizer on too early, it won't get pulled up. So we usually use split applications on blueberries, but peaches, first of all, you don't want to over fertilize peaches because they grow very aggressively anyway. And then if you're using organic fertilizers, a lot of those fertilizers need to break down. And so they can be added in the fall, and then they're more available in the spring when the plant will actually be able to take them up. So a fall application of organic, like manures, if you're using manures for a fertilizer, putting them in the fall, right when it's cold, is a really good idea. And then if you're using something like Chilean nitrate, which is a quickly available organic fertilizer, it's also quite expensive, but that can be treated like an inorganic fertilizer because it's going to be very quickly available and then it'll be gone.
Very good. You may have answered this question. I've been trying to follow some of the others here. So if you have, just tell me. Was a question asked about the best variety of blueberries for our planting area?
Well, that's really hard to answer because I know we've got a lot of people on the call and they're from different areas, but mostly we recommend the Northern High Bush category of blueberry, and there's dozens of cultivars that are good for that in that category. Or if you're in a particularly cold area, you should try the half-high hybrids, which are actually bred with low bush blueberries. They're very cold hardy. They're shorter in stature and the berry size is slightly smaller, but they're excellent quality berries. And those would be things in the Northland series, and they're called North Blue, Northland, North, I think one is called North Sky, those kinds of, there's about 5 or 6 different varieties of those.
Thank you on that. And then also, we have some extension publications yet, don't we? Or certainly online that you can recommend people look at for pruning. And beyond that, any pruning books that you would recommend for home gardeners?
Well, honestly, the best little home gardening, home fruit planting book is a fairly dated, but it's still excellent information. It's the Cornell Home Fruit Planting Guide, and you can download it for free from one of the websites at Cornell, and I could send that link to Lauren if maybe somehow it could be sent to people if they want it or whatever.
We could do that.
Yeah,
yes.
or even if you Google Cornell Guide to Home Fruit Planting or something, it should come up. The other thing that I would encourage people to do, if you're looking for, there's a ton of videos out there. There's a lot of really good, There it is. That Lauren is really amazing. Yes, Cornell Guide to Growing Fruit. And that has everything, berries, grapes, tree fruit, all different kinds of tree fruit, some of the more unusual fruit there. The other thing that you can do is go to, you know, if you Google University of Maine or University of Connecticut or Cornell University, there are a lot of videos that I'm not even aware of, but you can find them on YouTube or just the internet, and they really are helpful. It's really helpful to see it in action.
Next question, is there a good way to prevent red leaf on peach trees?
I am not a tree fruit specialist. Red leaf, I think, is a bacterium, and it's really hard to control. I don't know.
So I would say ask the person there to contact our master gardeners in whatever county you live in, or contact us, and we'll see
Yes.
what we can do to respond for you.
Right.
Next question is, I have several pear trees that are 8 to 9 years old and are way too tall, 15 to 18 feet. Does topping them, that is heading, once the main trunk is 1.5 inches thick possible? Two are
Yes.
well scaffolded, the other is a vase shape with many competing trunks. Can I cut back the interior of the vase and spread branches to get fruit? They fruit a little, but the birds get most of it.
So yes, you can top these trees. You can definitely top them. You'll have to keep topping them. As you saw in the video, they'll keep sending out suckers and leaders, and they'll try to grow taller than you need them to. But you just keep removing them. And then for the one that has the multiple leaders, yes, choose the best leader, and you can remove the other leaders. Now, what I would encourage you to do is to go a little bit carefully, like maybe remove 1 leader at a time each year, so that you don't have so much new growth that comes off of that you're just, it almost defeats the purpose. So I would remove one, and then next year remove another one. That's how I would handle that.
Changing the sweet cherries. My sweet cherry trees died at the same time they started to fruit. Very healthy looking until the second fruiting season, and then they just lost leaves. Fruit fell off and then dead. Sour ones are doing great. Any ideas?
My guess is that they had some fairly significant winter injury. And oftentimes what we see is that these plants will not collapse until they either are flowering or fruiting. And the whole plant will collapse, and it's just finally the vascular system has so deteriorated that they cannot support the crop. And so the whole plant collapses. Now, there are other diseases that might have caused that, but given the fact that the sour cherries are doing quite well, that's my guess is, and sweet cherries are much, much, much more susceptible to winter and frost injury than are sour ones.
Okay. It says, so when you have rabbit damage on your new blueberry growth, should you make a fresh new cut? And what do you think of ammonium sulfate fertilizer? What fertilizer schedule do you recommend for blueberries?
Ammonium sulfate fertilizer is the only fertilizer for blueberries, so excellent that you put that in there. Nitrate fertilizers are not good for blueberries because they're acid-loving plants. And the rabbit damage, and so when you put fertilizers out, I usually put the fertilizer in the first one, one application in the first half of May and the second application in the first half of June. Never fertilize a blueberry plant after the 4th of July. And that's usually, if you do that split application, you're doing all right. And the amount of fertilizer that you add, of course, depends on what you're using. But usually on a full grown plant, we're putting about 40 or 50 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre. So we'd have to convert that to square footage. But basically, it's not a heck of a lot. But it is important that you do it at those times. And then as far as the rabbit damage, you could go ahead and cut it again down, because if it's just like the rabbit damage around here, we'll have it anywhere between 6 and 12 inches. And if it's cut that, it's going to branch really, low, and that's not good. So you might want to just try to cut it. Yeah.
When I spray my apple trees, can I also spray pears, plums, peaches?
For the
And
most
what
part,
is this, and with the same product, and what is best to use? Would you
well, if you're
recommend an
using,
all-around orchard spray?
yeah, for most homeowners, I do, just because it's easier. And then what I kind of recommend to do a fairly reduced spray program for homeowners is to put a dormant oil or some kind of horticultural oil on. You know, if we get a nice gorgeous day like last week or earlier this week, spray then for soft-bodied insects, and then spray when you get just barely pink, like a little tiny bit of pink. You put the full orchard spray, which has a miticide, a fungicide, and an insecticide on. Then you can put one more application of that before buds totally open, if you have time, and then one application right after petal fall. So there's 3 applications that should solve most of your scab problems, that should solve most of your mite problems, aphid problems. And if you have good cultural habits and good sanitation, hopefully that will work and be all you have to spray.
So Laura, I used to recommend to people for spraying on brambles, if they only could get one spray in a year and just one, it's the lime sulfur would be the most helpful. Would you agree with that?
I certainly would, Don. And I'd also agree with that for blueberries. Lime sulfur is a fabulously, it's an organic chemical that smells bad and is kind of tricky to keep in suspension, but it does a beautiful job at the dormant time for controlling cane diseases for both brambles, caneberries, and blueberries. So yes, I would.
Well, let's make a last call for any more questions. We have let's take a question or two if Laura can hang in there. So we'll do that. And Laura, any other final parting advice while we wait to see if we get any more questions?
Save your pennies for one of those electric backpacks.
How many pennies? How many pennies?
They're almost $1,800.
Oh.
Yeah, a lot of pennies. Yep. But I've been using that in the woods. I've been doing some little pruning, and I really love that piece of equipment.
I could see it for making Christmas wreaths. Are they good for that?
They're good for anything. Yeah.
What was the wire cutting tool you suggested called?
Was that not a
well,
tool?
the question is, what was the wire cutting tool? What is the wire cutting tool that you suggested? What is its name?
I think I wasn't talking about a wire cutting. I was talking about a tying thing, and it's called a Max Tapener.
Yeah.
And I put it in the chat box. It's a little gizmo that kind of you can pop out with like a quick little and it puts this electric or this waterproof tape around the plants, and it has a little bit of expansion to it so that it doesn't girdle them, but yet it holds it quite snug to the wire. So it's a nice, it's a little bit faster. Once you get the hang of it, it's faster than tying everything.
Well, I think we're at our end. I want to thank all our participants. We had as many as I think 61 on at all time. I want to thank you, Laura. You did a terrific job covering a lot of territory. This is a topic that you could spend a few days on just discussing it.
A whole semester on.
Yeah, there's so much to it. And for those folks who still have questions, I'm not sure where everyone might be from, but you can certainly write us at CCE Schoharie. Well, let me get that again. Lauren, what is our email address? It's Schoharie at cornell.edu. That's it. Schoharie at cornell.edu. If you write us at that address, we'll be sure that we'll answer the questions, or we'll send it on to someone in your area who might be able to handle that for you. And if we get stuck on a question, we will ask Laura and she'll give us some good advice, I'm sure.
I will certainly try. All right, guys, have a great spring.
Thank you so much for joining us. I hope everyone has a great growing season and maximize our food production out there. Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.